The Zone of Interest by British director Jonathan Glazer has won the BAFTA for a film not in the English language as the awards ceremony gets underway in London. The nuclear bomb epic Oppenheimer is leading the pack with 13 nominations, including Best Film. Elsewhere, Claire Foy is up for Best Supporting Actress for her role in the heartfelt drama All of Us Strangers. Her co-star, Paul Mescal, is also up for a gong, although the film's lead, Andrew Scott, was notably snubbed. Sophie Ellis-Bextor will perform her 2001 hit Murder on the Dance Floor after it re-entered the charts, thanks to a scene in the film Saltburn, which is also up for 5 awards. Well, for the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Time now for the Camilla Tominey Show.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. It's wet, it's windy. Grab yourself a cuppa, don't go anywhere because we've got a fun-packed 90 minutes ahead. It's been another very busy week in Westminster. Labour has managed to secure 2 new MPs with big wins in this week's by-elections. Is Sir Keir Starmer on his way to number 10? I'll be asking Shadow Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds for his thoughts on this and the forthcoming Rochdale by-election, which Labour has suspended its candidate for. I'll be grilling the Minister of State for illegal migration, Michael Tomlinson. Can Rishi Sunak really stop the boats? And with reform on the rise, do the Tories have a hope of winning the next general election? Will it be in May or will it be in the autumn? We'll be discussing that too. I'll also be speaking to former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, the Tory MPs whose house was targeted this week by pro-Palestinian protesters. He'll be joining us live from the Munich Security Conference. As news broke of Putin's political opponent Alexei Navalny's death this week, I'll be joined by former British ambassador to Russia, Sir Andrew Wood, to find out what he makes of Foreign Secretary David Cameron's claim that there should be consequences for the Russian president. I'll also be joined by former Scotland Yard top cop David Murray-Gilbertson as we get to grips with whether the boys and girls in blue have lost their way. And the People's Panel is back. We are in Nottingham today, and as ever, we want to hear from you, our loyal GB viewers, and we want you to have your say. Right, let's get stuck into the Sunday morning papers. I'm delighted to be joined now by senior news political commentator Nigel Nelson with GB News, formerly of The Mirror and The People. Nigel, lovely to see you this morning. Let's start with Storming Starmer, as we're headlining it, because he's made a bit of an intervention at the Munich Security Conference. It's been interpreted by the Sunday Telegraph as a sort of slight on Donald Trump making that point about NATO defence spending. How do you interpret it? I mean, he's been over in Munich trying to look very prime ministerial.
Yeah, well, that's the point of going there, to actually show that he's there on the world stage, that he's about to be prime minister, and so he needs to meet foreign leaders. He doesn't actually mention Trump in this particular, in the article he's being quoted in. But what he's talking about is that people should actually pull together. So the issue at the moment is that Trump is saying, well, going rather over the top by saying, if NATO members don't stump up the 2% that they're meant to, then Russia can go and invade them. It seems to be the paraphrase he's using.
I mean, the second half of that seems a bit OTT, but the first half of it is a fair point, isn't it? I note as well in the Sunday Telegraph that, lo and behold, he's not even in power, and yet Trump is pushing the dial because a load of these European countries are now scrambling to make their 2% pledge because they don't want to look like they've got egg on their face if he becomes the next US president.
And I think that when Trump was president and made these comments by saying, look, everyone's got to actually stump up the money that they agreed in 2014. And back then, it was only the US, UK and Greece that actually were stumping up the money. Now, 11 NATO members are doing it, but you've still got a membership of 31, and Germany Germany, for instance, won't be able to get their money in place until 2031.
I mean, it's interesting, this intervention. He hasn't mentioned Trump, but, you know, everybody knows what he means. His shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy has been pretty robust in his criticism of Trump in the past. So have other members of the Labour Party. It's going to be a bit tricky, isn't it, if he's PM and Donald Trump is president?
It'll be tricky, but I mean, again, I think that Keir Starmer at some point will have to make a visit to America. But what he's also saying in this piece in The Telegraph is that he'll work with whoever is elected president. He's doing this sort of thing, the usual politician thing of not interfering with somebody else's election.
Although, is he being a little bit too complacent? He's released this slick video this morning looking very prime ministerial. There's a warning from David Blunkett in the Mail on Sunday today. Call me a party pooper, but Sir Keir Starmer must not take victory for granted. I mean, they've won these by-elections, but, you know, we haven't actually had a national vote. I appreciate what the polls are saying, but isn't it more about Tory apathy than Labour success?
Yes, certainly. I mean, both in Kingswood and Wellingborough, it's Tory voters mostly staying at home because they're just fed up with the Tory party. What David Blunkett says on the Mail on Sunday is that he's looking back not to the last few elections. He goes right back to 1964. And what he's saying...
Which you remember clearly, Nigel. I'm joking, Nigel.
Yes, I think it was in Nappers at that stage. So he's going back to 64. And what he says is, it's a similar situation, Tories in complete chaos. Labour looked like they were going to get an absolute landslide and ended up with just a majority of 4.
Yeah, Theresa May would have been happy with that.
Well, that's right, yes.
So that's a good point, isn't it? You know, this idea that they're already in power, I mean, needs to be avoided. Let's just move on as well to what the by-elections seem to be suggesting in terms of the timing of the next election. I can't really believe this, but the Mirror says the Tories are eyeing a May vote. Are they kamikaze? And Dan Hodges in the Mail on Sunday is also saying that the unpalatable truth is the longer Rishi waits to call an election, the worse it will be for the Tories. May election? Have they gone mad, Nigel?
Well, I think that they've been laying the groundwork for a May election since last year. What Mikey Smith is saying in the Sunday Mirror is that the reason they're thinking about it again is because they don't think that Rishi Sunak can last until the autumn because his own MPs might topple them. Dan is saying things aren't going to get any better, so you might as well go now. I mean, what they were doing was that back in November, the first thing was national insurance tax cuts. Now, what that did was they rushed that through in January, idea being you'd have 3 months in your pay packets until May.
Yeah, bedding in that economic benefit.
Then there was the promise to get the boats off.
Yeah.
And there were also, Whitehall officials were quietly talking to local authorities that weren't having elections on May the 2nd to see what the availability of their polling stations was.
Yeah.
So, given that, the only reason you could be doing that is you're thinking we might go for May. As things have got worse, now we're in recession, the polls are not closing, Rwanda is probably not going to work for some months anyway, even if it ever works at all. As a result of that, it makes a May election look less likely. We'll see. They may just cut and run and say, look, let's just do it.
Extraordinary stuff. Let's talk about the Farage factor quickly. Tories already fear reform. If Farage were his leader, they'd be truly terrified. I mean, that's in the Sunday Times. I think it's a pretty accurate assessment, isn't it? It's interesting to see reform doing that well without Nigel Farage in an official role. I appreciate he is in that honorary chairmanship role, and also without the name recognition that UKIP had.
Yes, and I mean, Nigel keeps teasing us about what he's actually going to do. We still don't know whether he's going to really get stuck into the election.
Do you want to know what I think he's going to do?
Go on.
Dive bomb in about 8 weeks before the election.
Could be. That's what the Tories are terrified of, the idea that it will be hit 2 months before. But some really interesting figures they come up with, that given that they got 13%, Reform got 13% of the vote in Wellingborough, which is about the same, a little bit more than UKIP got back in 2015. So they had 4 million votes in 2015, only 1 MP, but even so. The figures that the Sunday Times have come out with is the damage they could cause to the Tories. So at 10% of the vote, the Tories lose 39 seats, 12% 47 seats, 15% 63. So they are a significant, if when the polls narrow towards the election, and we are are just looking a lot closer, they could be the major player.
But the Farage factor, I think, puts up the predicted vote share to around that 17% mark, which is obviously like cataclysmic for the Tories. We will watch that with great interest and await Mr Farage's announcement when it comes. Let's just have a quick chat before we finish about the royals, because there's a couple of really interesting stories. First of all, that Prince William is building this social housing in Cornwall as part of his remit as the Duke of Cornwall. He's in charge now of the Duchy of Cornwall. But equally, there's this other story about how William will not allow Harry back into the family. First of all, I mean, in your previous sort of Mirror/People guys, the papers were very much against the monarchy. Isn't an initiative like this, William building social housing, likely to impress the left?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I am impressed that my position has been previously that I'm not a royalist, but I'm a monarchist. And I do think that it's things like this where they connect with the people, that is exactly what William should be doing. On the second point about Prince Harry, what Prince Harry has offered is he'll come back and do a few duties while his father is ill.
Yes.
William is saying...
That's good of him, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, yeah, whatever those duties might be, but William is saying, no way. I mean, according to briefings to the Sunday Express and Sunday Mirror, he says, look, we're just not going to have him. He's not coming back. I think that's probably right, that here you've got Harry who abandoned the working royal rota. He then slagged off his family, first on television, then in a book. It would be a bit difficult to actually bring him back, even in a kind of locum role.
I know, but I think it's really intriguing that this has sort of been briefed into the Sunday papers in the sense that, I mean, we saw him in Whistler in Canada with Meghan sort of promoting the Invictus Games. He was, according to a colleague, sort of came over and thanked the press for being there, which I thought was quite extraordinary.
Unusual.
And then they've relaunched this website featuring Meghan's royal coat of arms and very much referring to themselves in a royal sense using their titles. Is it that he is now dabbling with the idea of coming back to royal life because they've realised that it's their royal connections that give them meaning?
Well, I would have thought that it's only their royal connections that give them money, because that's why they don't want to get rid of titles and so on.
But that wasn't as part of the Sandringham summit. They were told in explicit terms by the late Queen and indeed at the time Prince Charles that they weren't to be cashing in on these royal connections.
But they did.
They weren't to be using these coats of arms and other matters.
But they did.
Yeah.
But at the moment it seems to be that they're a long way from being able to come back for a full kind of reconciliation. Personally, I'd like to see a reconciliation between Harry and the rest of the family. I know, that's me. Doesn't mean he has to do royal duties, though. No,
I think royal duties might be a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
Nigel Nelson, thank you for joining me this morning. Lovely to speak to you. Now, Will Hollis is in Nottingham with our People's panel this morning. Will, what's tying the people in knots in knots?
Good morning. Yes, well, we're live from Nottingham in the fantastic Brate's coffee shop. They've let us in early this morning because you can't talk politics without hearing from the ordinary people. But my panel today, Camilla, are anything but ordinary. They're extraordinary, aren't they? We've got Michael McKeever, who's a retired head teacher from Nottingham. We've got Catherine Bohm, who is an independent councillor as well as a landlady in nearby Eastwood. And we've got Jeff Hampson. You're a veteran and you're also a veteran support worker. We've got time for one question, guys. We've got all the politicians on Camilla's programme this morning. Michael, a retired head teacher, what might you like to hear from our shadow ministers and government ministers today?
I'd like to ask them what the strategy is to support public service in this country, especially schools, which are in crisis financially and in terms of recruitment.
Big problems with recruitment. Michael, don't go anywhere. Catherine, what might you like to hear from our politicians today?
Well, a lot of people are talking about illegal migration. What are we going to do about it? I'm a realist, not a racist, so let's find out what's happening.
Well, we've got the illegal migration minister on today, so it's the perfect time to ask that question. And Jeff, what do you think? A veteran support worker, what might you like to ask our politicians this morning?
Right, well, we have approximately 7,000 homeless veterans living on the streets, many with PTSD, who are getting no help from the government whatsoever. They can find the funds to house immigrants, but they cannot find the funds to help to take veterans off the streets.
So you'd like to hear from, what question might you like to ask Jeff?
What is the government going to do about it?
Jeff, thank you. Guys, we're not going anywhere. We've got a fantastic coffee shop and fantastic coffee. We've got the programme on as well in the corner. So come back to us in a little bit and we'll have plenty more to say about the politics this morning, Camilla.
Great to hear. Thank you very much to Will and our People's Panel in Nottingham. Now, don't go anywhere, because in just a few minutes I'll be speaking to the former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, after his house was targeted this week by pro-Palestinian protesters. He'll be joining us live from the Munich Security Conference in just a moment.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World, Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yep.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system. And
so there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offender behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to have your company this Sunday morning. I'm joined now by former chairman of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, the MP for Bournemouth East. Tobias, thank you for joining me from Munich. First of all, I have to ask you, how are you and your family? What a dreadful series of events you had to endure last week from these pro-Palestinian protesters effectively gathering in a mob outside your home.
Yeah, it was very surprising on a number of accounts to be told by the police, give them fair gratitude. They were able to see on the internet that an event was going to take place outside my house, warned me off to go there. But you don't expect this sort of behavior in today's day and age, and we need to make sure it does not become the norm. I think MPs, I expect a bit of rough and tumble. They expect criticism publicly and so forth. But when it comes to your house, you'd hope that there would be a line drawn on what is acceptable behaviour. And I'm very grateful to Tom Tugendhat, the security minister, and Chris Felt, the policing minister, to ask the police to look at the current laws to see whether they need to be improved, because otherwise it's not just the impact on families and so forth, it's also the next generation of parliamentarians, the people that we'd like to step forward into public life. More people would be put off by wanting to become an MP if we don't recognise some standards of which behaviour in demonstrations is allowed to operate.
I mean, I totally agree with that, and I see that you have praised Dorset Police for giving you advance warning so you didn't go back to your home. Although, have any arrests been made of those who descended on your property?
So this was very much a live conversation that evening. They had a series of police cars that were protecting my property, an armed response unit there as well to watch activity. Don't forget that when these demonstrations take place, which are very intensive, and dozens of people there, they almost want arrests to take place. They want to ratchet things up. And it was a view of the police on the ground to allow this to sort of fizzle out. They were there for 3.5 hours. They then dispersed. Imagine the number of police required to move them on or to sort of make arrests and so forth. Dorset Police made, I think, the right decision at this time. The bigger question, though, is...
I think we've just had Tobias Ellwood frozen there. Let's bring Nigel Nelson back into the conversation while we try and get Tobias's link back up. This is unfortunately the peril of speaking to somebody at the Munich security conference.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
I mean, I can't quite understand how it's now carte blanche for protesters to just descend on the home of MPs. It's not just Tobias Ellwood. We've seen this happen to Wes Streeting. We've had Mike Freer now, the MP for Golders Green, announce that he's got to step down. The threats to him are too much. I had Suella Braverman in this chair a couple of weeks ago telling me that she has had to hold on to her taxpayer-funded bodyguards that she had while she was Home Secretary. Normally, you don't keep them. You go off back into your normal constituency life and you don't need that protection. She does, because she keeps on receiving death threats. I mean, in my mind, it's extraordinary that the police have to tell an MP he can't go back to his home.
Yes, it is extraordinary. And bear in mind, Rishi Sunak also had his home attacked. No, it's not acceptable. I mean, certainly protests outside Parliament, that's the place for them.
I think we've got Tobias back. Sorry to interrupt, Nigel. Tobias, hopefully you can hear me again. Sorry, we just lost that link. Look, we've dealt with this issue with the police. Let's talk about the Munich security conference you're attending now. The reaction, quite understandably, to Alexei Navalny's death has been that of shock and horror. We've heard the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, talk about consequences for the Russian president. What consequences would you like to see?
Well, we simply just need to recognise how contested, how fragmented our world is becoming. And what President Putin is doing is a great example of that, of crushing opposition, of any criticism in his own country, but the wider intentions of what he wants to do, not just in Ukraine, but beyond. And the big debate here is, how do we then manage that? A world that's becoming ever more contested, more fragmented. What is the West doing about it? And the shadow of Trump was here, really was quite... I think a test of the West, indeed the American senators that were all here, because, of course, they're tying in their support for Ukraine with domestic issues to do with the Mexican border. And people in Europe here just simply don't get that. If we don't provide Ukraine the necessary assets, the military equipment that they need to actually take back their territory, then Putin will not stop there. We need to make that clear, that Europe is at war right now, and it will continue and gets worse unless we put this fire out.
I mean, I understand, Tobias, that you wouldn't be agreeing with Trump when it comes to, obviously, this $9 billion aid package, which the Republicans are blocking going to Ukraine. But at the same time, you must side with him when he calls for all of these NATO countries to honour this 2% of defence spending. We've heard Keir Starmer in the Sunday Telegraph sort of question that and say, you know, that he's being divisive and all the rest of it. But come on, I mean, these countries have to step up the cash, don't they?
They do indeed, but you don't do that with your allies by telling Putin to invade a NATO ally. That is not the way forward. And don't forget also that Trump, whilst he was president, actually threatened to pull out of NATO and then pivot to China. that America must understand that if Europe goes back into any form of conflict, larger conflict beyond Ukraine, it will have a knock-on economic consequence to America as well, and cost us more in the long term as well. That's why we need to get this right. That's why we need to focus on supporting Ukraine, and for their own British defense budget as well. It isn't just Ukraine. We see the Middle East as well. There are complexity of issues. We've entered a new era of insecurity. We are still on a peacetime budget. And we know that our Army, our Air Force, and our Navy aren't currently overstretched. So some big questions for Britain as well.
Let's bring it back to domestic matters. I've got Jeff on my People's panel in Nottinghamshire today. He's a former military gentleman, and he's basically talking about the number of homeless veterans, 7,000 he claims, many of whom are dealing with PTSD. He says, why aren't the government doing more to help them?
Well, there are many programs to support those. There's the Armed Forces Covenant, which actually obliges all councils up and down the country to make sure that those who have served their country with pride are then given the necessary support they need, particularly if they've got mental health challenges such as PTSD. So I'm sure if we get those details of where your panel were referencing, either myself or certainly you've got Johnny Mercer, who's been so focused on this, so dedicated on this, on making sure that we get the money through to the front line to support our valiant veterans.
OK, some interesting polling in the Sunday Telegraph today suggesting that 70%, Tobias, of Tory voters think it was wrong to ditch Boris Johnson.
Well, we've moved on from that. He's not even MP there, so it's actually a bit of a distraction as to where we need to go. General election is only months away. What are they suggesting? That somehow he then, somebody gives up their seat, he comes back in? My goodness, how disturbing that would be for the Conservative Party to then have another turn of the wheel, another selection process. Really, I think we need to recognise why he departed, why he had to go in the manner that he did. We now have a Prime Minister. Let's back the current Prime Minister.
OK, but unfortunately the country doesn't seem to be backing him. He hasn't pushed the dial any further forward in his favour since announcing his 5-point plan. The plan doesn't seem to be working. I mean, you're very much a centrist Tory. You talk about the importance of the broad church. How's that congregation going? Because the last time I checked, you've lost 2 by-elections and you're 20 points behind in the poll.
Yeah, and that's simply because we're not getting the airtime for people like you to scrutinise what Labour are doing, because we're spending the whole time having a bun fight with each other. And you go back, if I may, go back to the centre ground. The centre ground in British politics, the floating voter, that's how you win elections. When you go to extremes, onto the right or to the left, you will not win the general election. Jeremy Corbyn proved that when he was leader, and what we need to do is recognise the big grandees. We've had this conversation before. The big grandees, the big beasts who've won elections have gone for the centre ground. That's where the winning streak should be.
You're getting killed on the right, Tobias. At the end of the day, might the Tories have to entertain a deal with Nigel Farage and the Reform Party?
OK, so it takes you even further to the extreme, gifting that space to Labour, to the centre ground to Labour, and then they will actually then win. This is a false strategy. It really, really is. All right, Tobias Ellwood, thank you very much indeed for joining me from Munich. Lovely to speak to you this morning. Let's now speak to Shadow Minister without portfolio, Nick Tominey-Simmons, the Labour MP for Torfaen. Nice to see you, Nick. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. We understand that the SNP has tabled a motion calling for a ceasefire. They want to call for a second vote in the House of Commons. On one hand, we've got Keir Starmer resisting that, and on the other, we now have Scottish Labour saying that they support the motion. They think it's perfectly reasonable. So actually, Labour is split on a ceasefire.
We're completely united about seeing an end to the fighting.
But you're not united on a ceasefire, are you?
Well, we all want to get to a ceasefire. What we are saying...
Will you vote for one, then?
Well, look, we will need to look at the wording of the motion that is actually laid before Parliament.
Nick Tominey-Simmons, we need to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Now, don't move a muscle, because in just a minute, Sir Andrew Wood will join me, and I'll be grilling Michael Tomlinson, the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, which I know is important to you. You want to hear the answers to my questions to that. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Claire, you want to talk by cars growing by a couple of centimetres a year?
Yeah, well, 1 centimetre every 2 years.
Okay.
It's unrelenting because the people are so fixated on the big SUVs. The sales have gone through the roof, and yet it's James Nix, the analyst for Transport and Environment Campaign, said the author of the report on the trend said, spurred on by sales of the largest SUVs, vehicles are getting wider every year. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, it means that our roads weren't...
Comfortable ride, beautiful engines, smooth. I mean, it's luxury, it's gorgeous.
Well, as I know, I used to have two, but I don't...
You used to have 2 SUVs?
Well, one SUV at a time, but I had 2 brands of them. But I'd no longer drive in London now because I just don't see the point because of the ULEZ, because of the, you know, you can turn down a thing and get fined.
Parking spaces, whatever.
Yeah, the growth in car size also causes issues for their drivers. The report found that largely luxury SUVs, which are about 2 metres wide, no longer fit in off-street parking.
That's true.
They also leave too little space for passengers to get in and out of the vehicles in typical off-street spaces, and they're about 2.4 metres wide, the report found. And I'll tell you, I was stuck in a bus last night trying to get home, and the buses couldn't move because the streets were too crammed with all of these massive cars either side.
Chelsea tractors.
And it was gridlocked.
Yeah, but maybe they're not the problem, maybe the buses are the problem.
The buses take people to their place of work and get
I'd
them
like
home.
to know when, because when I go through London, all I see is empty buses.
Well, you're lucky. Every time I'm on one, they're full.
Well, they're obviously only full at rush hour. You see, the thing is, property developers, when they do high-rise car parks or, you know, they build a multiplex cinema and there's a car park attached to it, that's not my fault that I can't fit into their space. It's their fault. So
well, it's all driven by money, isn't it? The more spaces that they have, the more people they can get.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show on GB News. I'm delighted to be joined now by Sir Andrew Wood, former British ambassador to Russia from 1995 to 2000. You've said I can call you Andrew, so we'll drop the sir and be familiar, Andrew. Lovely to speak to you this morning. Now, Alexei Navalny's family have reacted to his death by saying it's orchestrated murder. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, and it's not the first time, and it won't be the last.
I know when you were in office, you met Putin a couple of times. Tell us what he's actually like.
Well, at the time, he was... we were talking about the possibility of his meeting with Tony Blair, and more immediately, the way that the war in Chechnya was then going, which is an extremely brutal war on the part of the Russians, but it was also one which attracted support for him as a future president. I didn't myself get a judgment as to whether he's a good man or a bad man, but we would see.
Yes, the jury was out at that point, but now 25 years on, from having first met him as Prime Minister to now, I mean, what's your assessment of where he is at, in the sense not only in the context of Ukraine, but obviously now the sudden death of Navalny? You could say that that was inevitably always going to happen. However, it does sort of move the dial really on, I suppose, the degree to which he isn't willing to stop.
He is not willing to stop, and in my eyes, he's defined himself as essentially a traitor to Russian interests. Russia itself and the Russian people aren't habitual killers and persuaded that the whole purpose of their life is to offend and attack others. But the fact is that he himself is stimulated by fear as being the right policy to introduce to other people. And he also himself, I think, suffers from fear because he's locked himself into a particularly vicious set of policies, and rather futile ones too.
I mean, you obviously got to know the Russian population very, very well in your time there. We've heard from Navalny's widow, Yulia, saying that she wants to continue his work. We've obviously seen protesters come out in support of Navalny on the streets of Moscow. There's been hundreds of arrests. What likelihood is there of there being an uprising among the Russian people in response to this death?
In direct response to his death, I do not think there is going to be such a reaction. It does touch on the proper feelings of large numbers of Russians, but at the same time, as I said earlier, this is not the first person he's killed. My very good friend Yemtsov was killed outside the Kremlin, and so on and so forth. They know that this is the way he acts, and they also are stuck with the immediate difficulty of how to react in the context of the war against Ukraine. Plus the fact is that there's no one else to replace him.
Are you worried about the prospect of a second Trump presidency in light of his relationship with Russia?
Well, I'm not a fan of his, so the answer is yes. But he's a changeable sort of person, and he has also, in his previous presidency, done some quite brave things and good things in the context that he was in. So I think you can't tell.
And when the Foreign Secretary David Cameron talks about consequences for Russia, look, we know that there have been sanctions, we know that Russian assets have been seized. Does it actually make any difference to Putin? I mean, what consequences can there possibly be for the Russian president in your mind?
I don't think direct consequences, but the fact that he's losing a grip on public opinion in other countries abroad is important. The fact that he is doing his best to hide what has happened to Navalny and the way it has happened in Russia itself is indicative. He's trying to put it as something which happened wasn't his fault, because nothing ever is. And he will hope it simply disappears in terms of the Russian electorate. And that might be right. He's bound to win when it comes to later this year, in March, because the system is so constructed.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, the timing of Navalny's death and, as you say, these forthcoming elections, which I think we can suggest now fairly plainly aren't going to be free and fair. Another question for you as a former ambassador, Andrew. I mean, where do you think, when it comes to looking at the Western world, the biggest threat is coming from? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it Iran? What's your assessment of the state of things at the moment?
Well, the immediate trigger is more likely, I think, to be Iran or the general chaos that's going on there, because we've got rather used to what's going on in Ukraine. I think we are being a little bit too gloomy about it because we concentrate on physical borders in Ukraine. We haven't looked sufficiently, for example, at the enormous success Ukraine has had in dealing with the Russian Navy. And that will be a long war, and a very threatening one for all of us.
Indeed so. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning, Sir Andrew Wood, former ambassador to Russia from 1995 to 2000. Well, coming up next, I'm going to be grilling Michael Tomlinson, the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, on the government's failure to stop the boats. Stay tuned.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
Mike Freer joins me now. Mike, thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Thank you for inviting me.
Firstly, how are you?
It's been a busy day, and it's been quite a traumatic experience. It's a real wrench to walk away from a job that you love, but also a constituency that you've become. You know, I live there; it's my home, and I regard many of my constituents as friends, and it is an amazing place. And to walk away from that is really quite. It's quite an emotional wrench to think this was a job I loved, but unfortunately I can't do it anymore.
Can you talk me through the process? Because you mentioned about the alleged arson attack, etc., being the final straw, but this has been a really quite vile journey to get to this point. So what kind of threats have you had? What's that look like?
Well, like every MP, I mean, you day in, day out, you get abusive emails, you get low-level stuff that, whether we should accept it, but we do, it's graffiti, you know, it's things like, you know, in the past I've had a mock Molotov cocktail left on the office door, meaning we had to evacuate the whole building. I've come out of my house and found a note on my car. Where I live is common knowledge, but what I drive is less so. And it's a few weeks after John Mann had the wheel nuts on his car tampered with. So that all kind of makes you get a bit, you know, what on earth's going on. But I've had 2 run-ins with the organisation that was Muslims Against Crusades, and people like Anjem Chowdhury, who was behind that organisation, been to prison. But online it said, I used to do surgery in mosques, so I wanted to go out and see people. And online, it's a picture of me saying, you're not welcome in our mosque, let Stephen Timms be a pointed reminder. So it's not very subtle.
Well, just for our viewers and listeners who might not remember that,
Stephen Timms, of course, was stabbed by a woman who'd been radicalised. Thank heavens he survived. So it was a very unsubtle.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by the Minister of State for Illegal Migration, Michael Tomlinson. He's also the Tory MP for Mid Dorset and North Poole. Lovely to see you this morning, Mr. Tomlinson. First of all, can I ask you about the death of Alexei Navalny? His family are saying this was orchestrated murder. Do you agree with that assessment?
May I say at the outset that Alexei Navalny was a courageous politician, somebody who stood up against Putin. If you think about, if we think that politics is difficult in the West, how much harder was it for Alexei Navalny to be standing up to Putin? And obviously my sympathy goes out to his wife and family and to all the Russian people. And I think the Foreign Secretary has been very clear on this, laying the blame firmly at Putin's door. He was absolutely right to do so, and I join him in doing it.
So orchestrated murder, then?
I agree with the Foreign Secretary that the blame is firmly at Putin's door.
When Lord Cameron's talked about consequences for the Russian president, what sort of consequences can we expect to see?
Well, we've already seen, for example, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that there have been 1,700 individuals and entities who have been sanctioned. We know that that has had an effect because Putin himself has accepted the difficulties that those have presented. Clearly, that is an option for the Foreign Secretary to look at, and I'm sure he'll have the time and the space to do that. But more broadly, I think you can see from our support for the people of Ukraine, you may have seen overnight, the extension of of the visa scheme for our Ukrainian friends who are over here seeking shelter and refuge in the United Kingdom. They now have the security and knowledge that they can be in the United Kingdom for a further 18 months. It was important to give them that certainty, and I think our broader support for Ukraine has been second to none.
Let's ask you about your brief as the Minister for Illegal Migration. I was quite surprised in the week to see a graph by the Oxford Migration Observatory suggesting that only 1.3% of those who have come here by boat illegally since 2018 have actually been removed from the country. That suggests that your policy on stopping illegal immigration has failed, and it's failed badly.
Well, let's look at that. Last year, boat crossings were down by 36%. 16,000 fewer people got in and made those dangerous crossings coming over. Of course, there is more to do. I was in France 48 hours ago seeing the work that was going on with our French counterparts, our French allies in this, and it's a joint mission. It is a joint endeavour stopping the boats between the French and the United Kingdom.
To only remove 1.3% of those coming here illegally, that is woeful. 1.3%. What message is that sending out to the people smugglers and indeed the people getting into barely inflatable dinghies? It's basically saying that almost 100% of you are going to end up being able to stay in the UK.
Camilla, I accept that there's more that needs to be done. You mentioned the flimsiness of the dinghies. Since the very first day in my office, I've been making the moral case for our Rwanda scheme. There have been many critics of it, many people saying that it wouldn't work or that it's not good enough. We have a moral imperative to make sure that people don't get on those boats. For the last 3 months, we have seen fatalities in the Channel. These people smugglers do not care if you're going to live or if you're going to die. They care about the bottom line. They care about profit. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important, and we see that back in the House of Lords tomorrow. We need to get that on the statute book. I'm sure you'll see some parliamentary ping-pong between the House of Lords and the House of Commons when amendments are inevitably
I know,
going to be
but
tabled
to only remove
made.
1.3%, Mr Tomlinson. 1.3%.
Well, Camilla, I'm telling you about what we're doing to increase that, because we need to get these planes off the ground. I'm hearing that message loud and clear. But in order to do that, and in direct response to the Supreme Court judgments of the 15th of November, we need to get the treaty in place. That was signed on the 5th of December. We need to get the treaty ratified. We need to get this bill through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and we need to get those planes off the ground. And that's my mission.
Can you clear something up for us? Because the Telegraph had reported that when you were Solicitor General, you advised that ignoring Strasbourg injunctions to block flights would be in breach of ECHR. So do you actually think this Rwanda policy is legal?
You wouldn't expect me to comment on legal advice, but what you would expect me to do is to say what I will do as Minister and what the Prime Minister has said he will do. The Prime Minister has been very clear that he will not let a foreign court block our Rwanda plan. I'm very clear that the legislation in Clause 5, it's there in the statute, when we get it onto the statute books, says that it's for a minister to decide. That is fundamental. That's why we need the law to be on the statute book. And when that law is on the statute book, that's when decisions will be made and the planes will get off the ground.
But aren't the disastrous by-election results for the Tories reflective of the fact that the public looks at the 5-point plan and has decided it's not working? You know, the plan on the economy isn't working. We went into recession. The plan on stopping the boats isn't working because you haven't stopped them, and we now find out that you've only removed 1.3% of those who came here legally. So, I mean, you are in dire trouble. The plan's not working, Mr Tomlinson.
Well, Camilla, let me take those in turn. You've mentioned 3 things. In relation to the by-election, there is no doubt that the by-election was set against a very difficult backdrop. One message that I have received from the by-election, loud and clear, is that if you vote for reform, you get Labour. You go back to square one with Labour. So
maybe you have to do a deal with reform then, Mr Tomlinson.
No, the message is loud and clear. A vote for reform is going back to square one, and you get Labour. So that's the first thing you mentioned. The second thing you mentioned was the economy. In relation to the economy, we have seen the Prime Minister's top priority was to halve inflation. Inflation was at 11.1%, don't forget. I'm sure you'll remember. It was 11.1%. It's now down at 4%. We need to see growth improving. One of the biggest blocks to growth is inflation. That is...
The other thing that's down, Mr. Tomlinson, is our living standards. I mean, maybe some people actually look on the last 14 years and say, we wouldn't mind going back to square one because we're in no better position now, 14 years on.
No, that's not right. If you look at the forecasters, if you look at the IMF that says forecasts that we are going to grow as an economy faster than France, faster than Germany, faster than Italy, faster than Japan. If you look at the OECD, if you look at the Bank of England and the OBR, they all say that there will be growth and that is coming. We need to stick to the plan. But the final piece of the jigsaw you mentioned was firmly in my brief. That was the Prime Minister's plan and is the Prime Minister's plan to stop the boats. That is something that's been given to me. The Prime Minister has given that to me to deal with. I was in France 48 hours ago. That is our mission, and I'm very clear that we absolutely must and will stop the boats.
OK. Mr. Tomlinson, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. I'm joined now by retired Scotland Yard Deputy Assistant Commissioner David Murray-Gilbertson. He's the author of this book, The Strange Death of Constable George Dixon. And he joins me now to discuss, David, the state of the British police. I mean, I know you've said a lot about it in this book. Let's just start with something that I raised with Tobias Ellwood, who you'll know had his house besieged by pro-Palestinian protesters last week. What do you make of the fact that there are no arrests, that the police are allowing these protests to continue? I had the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, in here a couple of weeks ago saying the police have the powers to stop this, they just don't use them.
It's what I say throughout my book. It's what I've said for years. It's a function of absolutely appalling leadership.
Right.
When you consider that the vast majority of officers on the street these days, male and female, have probably got less than 5 years service. The vast majority have just come from school or straight into the police service. They have no experience of life generally. You can't expect them to make really quite far-reaching decisions on technical issues without leadership. There is no leadership.
And do you think that's a result of perhaps a more lax approach to recruitment?
The standards in recruitment to police service at the moment are they're below rock bottom.
Well, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, you've got a situation, for instance, in 2022, Her Majesty's Inspectorate did a major review of recruitment. Something like about 10% of the recruits to the Met at the time of the inspection, were functionally illiterate. Take aside from that the issue of, again, the leadership garter, and that's a big issue for me, leadership in the service. The graduate entry scheme in the police was abandoned in 2004. My big thing about policing, and I mean, I was 35 years in the police service. I was proud to be a member of the police. I don't admit to being that now.
Really? What? Because you're ashamed?
It disappoints me. I feel ashamed of the way things have
gone. But that's such a sorry state of affairs.
It's a sorry state for me. I've got two sons who wouldn't have anything to do with the police service.
David, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning.
Mark Dolan tonight in My Big Opinion. Why are the Conservatives losing? Because they're not Conservative anymore. My Mark Meets guest is legendary former Labour MP and celebrated diarist Chris Mullin. And in My Take at 10, John Lewis are in hot water for launching a magazine which recommends breast binders for young girls. When did they give up selling electronic goods and the latest fashions? We're live at 9.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
You have a president in President Biden who's not enforcing the law that was passed by Congress. President Obama, criticize him or not, actually enforced the law and was deporting people that had crossed illegally. Of course, President Trump enforced the law and improved the law to make sure that, and worked with Mexico to have the Remain in Mexico policy. Biden has abandoned federal policy. In fact, he's deliberately trying to let in as many immigrants as possible. More for the Democrats, more is better and less is racist.
Just astonishing. And the statement that Greg Abbott put out is really feisty stuff. He said the federal government has broken the contract between the United States and the state of Texas. And the eye numbers, Greg, are simply eye-watering. 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years, Governor Abbott says. That's more than the population of 33 states in the United States. Astonishing numbers.
And Martin, that's just Texas. If you add Arizona and other border states, you know, it's pushing 10 million. By the end of Biden's term, it'll be 11 million. A study by Yale University a few weeks ago, 3 very liberal professors that did the study estimate there's 22 million illegal aliens. So this is a crisis that was created by Biden. It's what he wants. They want unfettered access to the border. They're letting them in. It's a real hardship on the working people of Texas and other border states. And now it's a real hardship on cities that the federal government, as well as the governors of Texas and other states, are sending some of the migrants to those so-called sanctuary cities.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the